Some of the wealthiest organizations in history were run by people who owned nothing. This is the paradox of monastic economies, a system where silent orders of monks built vast fortunes while taking vows of poverty. You will learn the hidden mechanics of how prayer and manual labor forged financial empires that rivaled kingdoms. How did men sworn to silence master international trade? And why did their spiritual quest lead to such immense material power? What does it mean for an institution to grow rich by staying poor? A single monk owned nothing but the rough woolen habit on his back. Yet the monastery he called home could command landscapes of rolling vineyards, flocks of sheep numbering in the thousands, and forges that echoed day and night. This was the monastic paradox in its purest form, a world where vows of individual poverty fueled the engine of collective, staggering wealth. How could such a contradiction not only exist but flourish for centuries? The answer lies in a foundational text and a simple, powerful motto. Saint Benedict of Nursia, writing his rule for monastic life in the 6th century, never intended to create financial empires. His goal was spiritual order and self-sufficiency. He established the principle of ora et labora, prayer and work, demanding that his monks balance divine worship with manual labor. The monastery was to be a world unto itself, needing nothing from the outside. This ideal of self-reliance contained the seed of immense economic ambition. A community that produces all it needs soon produces a surplus, and that surplus, whether in grain, wine, or crafted goods, became the first brick in a fortress of wealth. The critical distinction, both theologically and practically, was between the individual and the institution. A monk took a vow of personal poverty, relinquishing all private property. But the monastery itself, as a spiritual corporation, could and did own property, amass riches, and engage in trade. This wealth was not for personal luxury, it was argued, but for the greater works of God, for charity, and for ensuring the community's survival and influence. The humble monk in his simple habit was thus a cog in a fantastically complex and powerful economic machine, a system where spiritual devotion was inextricably linked to material production. But that seed of economic ambition required a specific kind of soil to truly flourish. It was the Cistercian order, founded in the late 11th century, that took the monastic ideal and forged it into a revolutionary economic engine. They were not merely monks, they were agrarian entrepreneurs and corporate pioneers on a scale never before seen. Their method began with a deliberate flight from the world. They sought out the wilderness, the desolate valleys and dense forests everyone else considered worthless. To them, these were not deserts of despair, but blank slates of immense potential. Armed with nothing but their rule and an unshakable work ethic, they would descend upon these remote locations and begin a transformation that seemed almost miraculous. Through backbreaking labor, they cleared forests, drained swamps, and built sophisticated irrigation systems, turning wastelands into some of the most productive farmland in Europe. These vast estates, known as granges, became the powerhouses of their wealth. This was a radical break from the feudal economy that surrounded them. While most lords and even older monasteries derived their income from collecting rents and dues from peasant tenants, the Cistercians did something different. They practiced direct exploitation. They owned the land and they worked the land themselves, or more accurately, they managed its cultivation directly. This allowed them to control every aspect of production, from planting to harvest, maximizing efficiency and capturing 100% of the surplus. The key to this system was their innovative use of lay brothers, known as conversi. These were men who took religious vows but were not required to spend their days in the lengthy liturgical prayers of the choir monks. Instead, the conversi were the muscle and the managers of the vast agricultural enterprises. They lived in the granges, tending to enormous flocks of sheep, working the fields and operating the mills. This division of labor was a masterstroke. It freed the choir monks for their spiritual duties while creating a dedicated, disciplined workforce that powered a relentless economic machine. Furthermore, the Cistercians did not operate as isolated abbeys. They were a tightly knit network, a spiritual and economic federation. Their architecture was starkly standardized, their administration highly centralized under the authority of the mother house Cistercians. This meant that a successful technique for wool production developed in Yorkshire could be quickly shared with an abbey in Burgundy. Resources were pooled, and profits were reinvested across the entire order. They were, in essence, a multinational corporation centuries before the term existed. They did not just farm, they industrialized agriculture, achieving efficiencies of scale that were unheard of. Their sheep farms, in particular, became legendary, producing wool of such high quality and in such staggering quantities that they came to dominate the international textile trade. So what specific industries did this silent corporation come to control? Their reach extended far beyond simple subsistence. The Cistercian Grange was a fortress of efficiency in a fragmented world. Picture a sprawling estate, not of a feudal lord with his dependent peasants, but of a silent order, managed with the precision of a modern corporation. This was the Grange System, the absolute core of monastic wealth. Each grange functioned as a specialized, self-contained economic unit, reporting directly to the mother abbey. One might focus entirely on vast fields of wheat and barley, while another was dedicated to the immense flocks of sheep that would become the backbone of Europe's textile trade. This specialization allowed for a level of expertise and productivity that scattered peasant plots could never match. To sustain this output year after year, the monks perfected agricultural science. They implemented the three-field system of crop rotation, a revolutionary practice for its time. Instead of farming the same soil until it was exhausted, they divided their lands into three sections. One field would be planted with a winter crop like wheat, a second with a spring crop like oats or barley, and the third would be left fallow, allowing the earth to rest and regain its nutrients. This simple but brilliant cycle dramatically increased yields and ensured long-term soil health, creating a reliable and growing surplus. But their innovation did not stop at the field's edge. The Cistercians were masters of hydraulic engineering. They harnessed water power not just for spiritual reflection but for grinding grain. Their water mills, often massive and technologically advanced for the era, turned the laborious task of milling flour into a continuous, automated process. More dramatically, they used this same engineering prowess to reshape the land itself. They drained swamps and marshlands, areas everyone else had written off as useless. With complex systems of ditches and canals, they transformed these wetlands into rich, profitable farmland, literally creating new value from nothing. This highly organized system generated enormous surpluses, and surplus, when sold at local markets and international fairs, generated pure cash. This cash flow was the lifeblood that allowed the monasteries to expand, to build, and to invest. The Grange was therefore more than just a highly productive farm. It was a powerful statement of economic independence, a declaration that this silent order was free from the tangled obligations of the feudal world. Its success demonstrated a capacity for large-scale planning and disciplined organization that was virtually unseen elsewhere. With such a powerful and reliable agricultural base generating steady wealth, the monks were perfectly positioned to venture into even more lucrative and specialized industries. The silent fields of the north echoed with the bleating of millions. While their granges produced grain, the true financial engine of the Cistercian order was the humble sheep. These animals were not merely livestock, they were a form of walking currency, their fleece a commodity as valuable as silver. In the rolling hills of England, abbeys like Revolks and Fountains became the epicenters of this wool trade, operating on a scale that dwarfed the estates of kings. How did a religious order master an international industry? The process began with a scientific approach to the flock itself. The lay brothers were not just shepherds, they were master breeders. They selectively cultivated strains of sheep, most notably the hardy Yorkshire breeds, to produce a fleece that was long, fine, and strong. This was not coarse wool for peasant tunics. This was a premium product destined for the luxury cloth markets of Europe. The quality was so consistent and so renowned that it became a brand. A merchant in Bruges or Florence purchasing a sack of Cistercian wool knew exactly what he was getting, a reliable, high-grade raw material. This consistency was the direct result of the order's centralized corporate structure. Instructions on breeding and flock management circulated from the mother house, ensuring that standards were maintained from Wales to the Scottish borders. The annual shearing was a monumental operation, a carefully orchestrated event that transformed wool into wealth. The fleeces were sorted with meticulous care, graded by fineness and cleanliness, then pressed into massive sacks known as wool sacks. Each sack was a compact fortune. These sacks did not head to a local market. They were loaded onto carts and ships, beginning a long journey to the commercial powerhouses of the age, the cloth-making cities of Flanders and the merchant republics of Italy. The revenues flowing back to the abbeys were staggering. It was this river of gold, earned from the backs of their flocks, that paid for the soaring stone arches and radiant stained glass of the great abbey churches. The silent monks praying in their remote cloisters were financially entangled with the most dynamic and cosmopolitan economies of medieval Europe. Their spiritual isolation was an illusion, their economic integration was absolute. With such immense capital flowing into their coffers, the monks could now turn their disciplined minds to an even more transformative power, the industrial potential of water. The rhythmic clang of the hammer was the true heartbeat of monastic wealth, a sound that echoed far beyond the quiet sheep pastures. While their agricultural empire was built on grain and wool, the Cistercians also mastered a far more elemental force, the power of iron. Deep within the forests they owned, in places like the English forest of Dean or the French regions of Burgundy, they established some of the most sophisticated ironworks of the medieval world. These monastic forges were not small, smoky workshops. They were early industrial complexes, glowing day and night with a fiery purpose. The key to their efficiency was once again their mastery of water. They channeled streams to drive massive water wheels, which in turn powered enormous mechanical hammers and giant bellows for their furnaces. This hydraulic machinery transformed the strenuous work of forging. The water-powered hammer, lifting and dropping with relentless, tireless force, could shape red-hot iron into bars and tools with a speed and consistency no human blacksmith could ever match. Similarly, the water-powered bellows created a constant, super-hot blast of air, raising the temperature of their furnaces to levels that produced higher quality iron in greater quantities. What did they do with all this metal? They became manufacturing powerhouses. Their forges produced the essential building blocks of a growing economy, thousands upon thousands of nails for their own endless construction projects, sturdy tools for their own granges and for sale to local farmers, and even weapons and armor for noble patrons. This was a complete vertical operation. The order owned the forests that provided the charcoal fuel, the streams that provided the power, and the mines that provided the ore. They controlled the entire production chain, from raw material to finished product, capturing every bit of profit along the way. This move into heavy industry reveals a deeply pragmatic and resourceful mindset. The monks saw a stand of trees not just as timber for building, but as potential fuel for a furnace. They saw a fast-flowing river not just as a source of spiritual contemplation, but as a source of mechanical force. Their vow of poverty did not mean a rejection of wealth creation. It meant a disciplined, corporate-driven effort to harness every natural asset on their vast landholdings for the benefit of the institution. The income from their forges and foundries perfectly complemented the rivers of gold from their wool trade, creating a resilient and staggeringly diversified economic portfolio. This industrial activity forces us to reconsider the image of the isolated, purely contemplative monk. These were men of prayer who were also brilliant industrial managers, adopting and advancing technology with a foresight that rivaled the most ambitious secular lords. With such immense and diversified wealth flowing into their treasuries, a critical question emerges. How did these sprawling, economically powerful institutions manage their finances and exert their influence across the whole of Christendom? Their vast economic empire rested on a single, sacred command, a motto that echoed through every cloister and every field. Ora et labora, pray and work. This was not a mere suggestion for a balanced life. It was the very soul of the monastic machine, the theological engine that made their immense wealth possible. Saint Benedict's rule, written centuries before the great Cistercian expansion, provided the spiritual blueprint. He dictated a daily rhythm divided equally between the divine office, sacred reading, and manual labor. In this worldview, physical work was never a lowly chore or a punishment. It was a form of prayer in itself, a sacred act that honored God by perfecting His creation. Tilling the soil, shearing a sheep, even forging a nail, these actions were imbued with spiritual meaning. They were participating in God's work through their own hands. This ideology fundamentally transformed the nature of economic activity. For the monk, turning a profit was not a worldly distraction from his spiritual calling. It was an integral part of it. The wealth they generated through their disciplined labor had a holy purpose. Every bushel of surplus grain, every sack of premium wool, every bar of high-quality iron was not for personal enrichment. The proceeds sustained the monastic family, funded immense acts of charity for the surrounding poor, and most visibly glorified God through the construction of those breathtaking cathedrals and abbey churches that still stand today. This spiritual mandate provided a powerful shield against any accusations of hypocrisy. How could an order sworn to poverty be so rich? The answer was in their purpose. The individual monk owned nothing. The institution's wealth was not for luxury but for divine service. Their commercial success was seen as a sign of God's favor, a blessing upon their holy labors. This belief lent an unshakable legitimacy to their endeavors, allowing them to trade, innovate, and accumulate capital with a clear conscience. Their economic power was not a corruption of their faith, but a direct expression of it. This fusion of prayer and profit created a uniquely motivated workforce, one driven by a divine calling rather than mere personal gain. While the rhythmic clang of Cistercian hammers echoed across Europe, a different kind of silence reigned in the high valleys of the French Alps. Here, the Carthusian order built its own form of wealth, not on the back of sprawling estates, but within the quiet confines of a monk's solitary cell. Their vow was not just to poverty, but to an extreme solitude that made the Cistercian life seem communal by comparison. How could such profound isolation generate any economic power at all? The answer lies not in the scale of their production, but in the supreme value of what they produced. A Carthusian monk lived most of his life in a small, individual house centered on a private garden. This was his entire world, a space for prayer, study, and the manual labor required for his simple sustenance. This structure, designed for spiritual perfection, also shaped a unique economic model. Without vast fields to tend or huge flocks to shear, the Carthusians turned inward, focusing on crafts that required immense skill, patience, and secrecy, all of which they possessed in abundance. Their capital was not land, but their disciplined silence and their reputation for unassailable piety. The most famous example is the luminous green liqueur that still bears their name, chartreuse. In the early 18th century, the order was given a mysterious manuscript containing an ancient and complex recipe for an elixir of long life. This document, a puzzle of herbal lore, was perfectly suited to the Carthusian temperament. In the stillness of their cells and their private workshops, they perfected the formula, macerating over 130 alpine herbs and plants to create a unique and potent beverage. They did not mass-produce it, they crafted it in small, precious batches, guarding the recipe as a sacred trust. This secrecy and the aura of monastic mystery surrounding its creation made chartreuse a luxury good of immense prestige. It was not a product one merely drank, it was a tangible piece of a spiritual legend, and the steady, reliable income from its sale provided for the order's needs for centuries. Their other great specialty was the world of books. In an age where every text was written by hand, the Carthusians became master scribes and bookbinders. The work of copying manuscripts was a natural extension of their silent, contemplative life. Hunched over a parchment in the soft light of his cell, a monk could spend months on a single volume, his labor a form of prayer inscribed in ink. The quality of their work was exceptional, their script precise and beautiful, their bindings durable and elegant. They produced Bibles, theological works, and philosophical texts that were sought after by universities and noble libraries across Christendom. This was another high-value, low-volume enterprise, leveraging their unique lifestyle to create products of unparalleled craftsmanship. The Carthusian model presents a stark contrast to the Cistercian Empire. Where the Cistercians won through overwhelming scale and corporate might, the Carthusians triumphed through intense specialization and an unshakable brand. Their economic strength was built on things that could not be easily replicated, a secret recipe or the patient skill of a scribe's hand. They proved that economic resilience could be forged in solitude, and that the most valuable commodity in a noisy world was sometimes a profound and productive silence. This disciplined management of high-value goods required an equally sophisticated system to handle the wealth it generated, a system that would eventually connect these silent monasteries to the bustling marketplaces of a changing world. Behind every silent choir monk stood a quiet army of laborers. These were the lay brothers, the conversi, the invisible workforce that powered the entire monastic economy. While history often remembers the abbots and the scribes, it was these men who cleared the forests, tended the 1,000-strong flocks, and kept the forges burning through the night. They took the same vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience as the choir monks, but their prayer was expressed not in Latin chant, but in the sweat of their brow and the skill of their hands. They were the managers on the ground, the master shepherds who understood the intricacies of breeding, the millers who harnessed water power, and the blacksmiths who shaped iron. Without them, the ideal of ora et labora would have remained a beautiful dream, utterly incapable of building an empire. So who were these men, and why would they choose such a life? They were largely recruited from the peasantry, men from the lower rungs of a rigid feudal society. For them, Entering a monastery as a conversus was not a step down, but a profound step up. It offered something the outside world rarely could: spiritual purpose combined with physical security. They exchanged a life of backbreaking labor for an overlord, for a life of backbreaking labor for a divine cause, within a community that guaranteed food, shelter, and brotherhood. They were part of something greater than themselves, insulated from the famines, wars, and arbitrary taxes that plagued the medieval countryside. This division of labor was a stroke of organizational genius. The choir monks, often from noble families, were freed to devote their waking hours to the 8 sacred offices of the divine liturgy and to scholarly study. The lay brothers handled every practical concern. They lived and worked in the outlying granges, reporting to a monastic cellarer who acted as a chief operating officer. This system allowed the monastery to function as both a spiritual powerhouse and an economic one simultaneously, 2 engines running in perfect, synchronized harmony. Managing this dispersed workforce required administrative skills we would recognize in a modern corporation. Monastic leaders had to motivate, house, feed, and spiritually care for hundreds of men spread across vast territories. They had to ensure standards were maintained, that the wool from a grange 50 miles away met the exacting quality the order's reputation was built on. This was not a task for a mere spiritual guide. It was a job for a chief executive, a leader who could balance the books, understand supply chains, and maintain the morale of a dedicated yet human workforce. The lay brother was the human resource innovation that made monastic wealth possible, a testament to the fact that true economic power is built not just on land and resources, but on the disciplined hands and willing hearts of countless unseen individuals. With this immense and organized human capital driving their enterprises, the monastic networks began to weave a financial web that would eventually span the entire continent. The sound of rushing water was the constant, rhythmic pulse of the monastic machine. Far from being a simple backdrop for contemplation, every stream and river was assessed with an engineer's eye, seen as a source of tireless, cost-free mechanical force. The monks did not just build near water, they rebuilt the landscape to command it. They became master hydrologists, constructing elaborate networks of diversion channels called leats, storage ponds, and sluice gates to ensure a steady, powerful flow to their water wheels regardless of the season. This was not a single invention but a systematic adoption of power that revolutionized their production lines. The most common application was the massive grain mill, a cornerstone of any abbey's self-sufficiency. But their vision extended far beyond grinding flour. They adapted the same principle to drive the heavy wooden hammers of a fulling mill, where woven wool was pounded and cleansed in a mixture of water and clay, a process known as fulling. This mechanization transformed a slow, labor-intensive chore done by human feet into a continuous, automated operation that could process vast quantities of cloth for the textile trade. The same relentless rhythm of the water wheel powered the trip hammers of their iron forges, shaping red-hot metal with a force and consistency no human arm could match. They even applied this power to sawmills, using the wheel's motion to push a saw blade back and forth through massive tree trunks, turning the arduous task of timber preparation into a swift, efficient process. This widespread mechanization provided an overwhelming advantage. While a secular lord might rely on the muscle of oxen or the weary arms of his tenants, the monastic factory ran day and night, powered by the river itself. This was not passive technology use, it was active innovation. The monks were constant improvers, tweaking the design of their water wheels for maximum efficiency, adjusting the pitch of their mill races to increase flow, and sharing these improvements across their international network. A more effective sluice gate design developed in one French abbey could be documented and replicated in a German monastery within a few years. This commitment to technological progress underscores a deeply pragmatic mindset. Their vow of poverty did not mean rejecting efficiency. It meant pursuing it with a religious fervor, understanding that better technology meant greater surplus, and greater surplus meant more resources for their sacred mission. Their wealth was built not just on land and labor, but on the intelligent, systematic harnessing of nature's own power. A monastery's wealth was not measured in gold alone, but in the sheer scope of its geography. Beyond the familiar granges and forges lay a patchwork of estates, forests, and farms that could stretch for hundreds of miles. How did a community of silent monks govern such a sprawling territory? The answer lies in a hidden world of meticulous administration, a bureaucracy that would have impressed any royal court. At the heart of this system were two key officials. The cellarer was the master of provisions, a role of immense practical importance. He was responsible for feeding the entire community, from the choir monks to the army of lay brothers. This meant he managed the vast storehouses of grain, salt, and smoked fish, coordinated the delivery of wool from distant granges, and ensured the forges never ran short of charcoal. He was, in essence, the chief operating officer of a multinational enterprise, his decisions directly impacting the physical well-being of hundreds. Working alongside him was the bursar, the guardian of the purse. This monk tracked every penny of income from wool sales, every expense for new building projects, and every charitable donation made to the poor. His ledgers, often written on long parchment rolls, were monuments to detail, recording transactions with a clarity that was centuries ahead of its time. This reliance on the written word was a monastic superpower. In a largely illiterate world, the monks used charters to legally secure their landholdings and painstakingly kept annual account rolls that tracked production yields from every farm and revenue from every market. These were not simple notes, they were sophisticated financial instruments that allowed for long-term planning and investment. But how did the central authority ensure that a distant abbey, perhaps weeks of travel away, was adhering to the order's strict standards of both piety and profit? The solution was the system of visitation. The abbot from the mother house would periodically travel to each daughter monastery. This was not a friendly social call, it was a rigorous audit. He would inspect the account books, walk the fields and workshops, and interview the monks, looking for any signs of financial mismanagement or spiritual laxity. His report could lead to the removal of a local abbot or the reallocation of resources across the entire network. This structure of checks and balances created a self-correcting, self-improving organization. The silent work of the cellarer and the bursar, guided by the unblinking eye of the visitor, formed an administrative engine that was every bit as revolutionary as their water mills. Their spiritual calling demanded not just faith, but an unmatched level of organizational genius, proving that the true foundation of their immense wealth was laid not in the soil, but in the scroll. A sack of Cistercian wool was a promise of quality that traveled far beyond the monastery walls. These silent institutions were not self-contained islands, but vital hubs in a sprawling web of commerce that stretched across Christendom. Their economic power relied on getting their goods to the markets where they could command the highest prices, and they developed a sophisticated system to do just that. A critical advantage came from the highest authority, the papacy. Many monasteries secured papal privileges, granting them exemption from the countless tolls and taxes that burdened other merchants. Every river crossing, every mountain pass, every entry into a town usually required a payment to the local lord. For a merchant transporting goods across hundreds of miles, these fees could devour any potential profit. But a monastic convoy displaying the correct seal and documents could pass freely. This gave them an immense competitive edge, allowing their wool, wine, and iron to reach distant markets at a significantly lower cost than their rivals. The final destination for their most valuable commodities was often one of the great international fairs, like the legendary cycle of fairs in the Champagne region of France. These were not simple local markets, but massive, temporary cities of commerce that attracted merchants from Italy, Flanders, and beyond. Here, the monastic brand was their greatest asset. A merchant from Florence purchasing cloth for the wealthy elites of his city did not need to inspect every sack of Cistercian wool. He knew its quality was guaranteed by the order's reputation for disciplined, standardized production. This brand loyalty allowed the monks to sell their entire annual clip in bulk, often on credit, securing premium prices long before the sheep were even sheared. The monks themselves rarely haggled in the noisy fairgrounds. They operated through trusted lay agents or Carthusians, men who acted as their commercial representatives. These agents negotiated contracts, arranged shipping, and navigated the complexities of international currency exchange. This required the monastic administration to be deeply knowledgeable about market fluctuations, contract law, and finance. Their account books show a keen awareness of prices in different regions and the relative values of various coins. They were not passive recipients of charity or rent. They were active, calculating players in the commercial revolution that was transforming medieval Europe. The silent prayers in the cloister were, in a very real sense, underwriting the vibrant, noisy economy of the outside world. This deep integration reveals a profound truth. Their spiritual isolation was an economic strategy, not a disengagement from the world. They built their wealth by mastering it. The glittering gold that adorned their altars began to cast a long, troubling shadow. As monastic coffers swelled, a chorus of unease grew louder, echoing from within the very walls of the church itself. How could these communities, founded on the radical poverty of Christ and his apostles, justify such immense material power? This was not an attack from outsiders, but a painful, internal reckoning. The most powerful critic emerged from within the Cistercian order itself. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, a man whose own monks were building an economic empire, launched a devastating verbal assault on the older Benedictine houses, particularly the Cluniac order. He described their monasteries not as houses of prayer, but as palaces of staggering vanity. He mocked their soaring towers that scraped the sky, their walls covered in lavish paintings and carvings that distracted the soul, and the rich foods that filled their refectories. For Bernard, this was a profound betrayal of the monastic vow. The original call was to renounce the world, not to recreate its luxuries within the cloister. His criticism struck a deep chord because it came from a place of deep spiritual authenticity, highlighting the agonizing tension at the heart of the entire system. This was the problem of success. The very discipline and efficiency that generated wealth for God's work also created an environment where that wealth could corrupt the original, austere ideal. The sight of a monk living in a structure as grand as a royal castle, funded by the labor of thousands, seemed to many a direct contradiction of a vow of poverty. This spiritual crisis sparked waves of reform that rippled through the centuries. Each new movement sought to return to the perceived purity of the early church. Most famously, in the 13th century, Saint Francis of Assisi took this critique to its logical extreme. He and his Franciscan friars renounced not only personal property, but institutional property as well. They were to own nothing, relying entirely on daily charity for their survival. This was a direct, living protest against the settled wealth of the traditional monastic orders. The Franciscans became a walking sermon on apostolic poverty. their very existence a silent challenge to the fortified abbeys and bustling granges of the older system. This constant internal pressure forced the wealthy monasteries to continually justify their existence. They could not simply be economic powerhouses, they had to be seen as spiritual and social benefactors. In response to the critics, many houses dramatically expanded their charitable works. Their gates became a place where the poor could always receive a loaf of bread. Their infirmaries cared for the sick and the dying, and their surplus wealth was channeled into patronage of the arts and education, building libraries and supporting universities. This was their defense. Their wealth, they argued, was not hoarded but recycled, serving the common good and glorifying God through magnificent acts of charity and culture. The silent orders were thus caught in a perpetual dance, balancing on a tightrope between the spiritual ideal of poverty and the practical demands of an institution destined to endure. A fortune poured into stone and glass can seem like a paradox, but for the monastic orders, it was the ultimate expression of their purpose. The wealth generated by thousands of silent workers was not locked away in treasure chests. It was transformed into the very skeleton of medieval civilization, funding a building boom that reshaped Europe from the ground up. The most visible declaration of this power was the great abbey church itself. Places like Cluny in France or Durham in England were not just buildings, they were statements of divine ambition carved in stone. To erect these colossal structures required more than faith, it demanded a fortune. The costs were staggering, from quarrying and transporting tons of limestone to paying armies of skilled stonemasons, carpenters, and glassmakers. A single project could employ thousands of craftsmen for decades, creating a ripple effect that energized entire regional economies. The local quarry saw a surge in business. The forests were managed for timber, and a small city of support services would spring up around the construction site. This was economic stimulus on a royal scale, all directed by a silent religious order, but their patronage extended far beyond their own walls. Monasteries became the primary sponsors of art and learning in an age with no ministries of culture. Within the cloister, the scriptorium hummed with quiet activity. Here, monks meticulously copied not only religious texts, but also the surviving works of Greek and Roman philosophers, scientists, and poets. While wars raged and kingdoms fell outside, these scribes performed an act of profound preservation, saving the intellectual heritage of the classical world from oblivion. Their libraries became the universities of their day, attracting scholars and storing knowledge that would fuel the Renaissance centuries later. Their compassion had a practical price tag as well. Almost every major monastery maintained an infirmary and a hospice, offering free medical care to the surrounding population and shelter for the destitute and the dying. This was a massive, ongoing charitable operation, funded entirely by the surplus from their granges and forges. Why would they do all this beyond the spiritual mandate? This lavish expenditure generated immense soft power. A monastery that could build a cathedral, educate a lord's son, heal a peasant's family, and employ a region's artisans made itself utterly indispensable. Kings and nobles sought their counsel, donated land to secure their prayers, and relied on their administrative expertise. The abbot of a great house was as much a political and economic magnate as a spiritual one. The stone pillars and stained glass windows were more than beautiful. They were the physical manifestation of a unique fusion, a silent order's economic capital made permanently, gloriously visible. This cultural and political influence, however, would soon face a threat that no amount of wealth could simply buy off. A king's inventory reveals the true scale of this silent power. In the year 1086, 2 decades after his conquest of England, William I ordered a survey so comprehensive it was said that no hide of land, no ox, cow, or pig would escape the notice of his commissioners. The result was the Domesday Book, a sprawling administrative document that catalogued the wealth of the entire kingdom. For us, it acts as a financial snapshot, a rare moment of hard data that illuminates the staggering economic footprint of the monasteries. The entries for the great abbeys are not just lines of text, they are ledgers of immense influence. Glastonbury Abbey, for instance, is recorded as holding lands in dozens of counties, with an annual value assessed at over £800, a colossal sum for the era. Ely Abbey's holdings were so vast and complex they required their own separate booklet within the greater survey, the so-called Liber Iliensis. These religious houses were not merely significant landowners, they were economic superpowers, their territorial reach and revenue streams rivaling those of the wealthiest secular barons and, in some cases, the crown itself. This was not just about owning land, it was about what that land produced. The Domesday entries meticulously detail the resources each monastic estate commanded. We learn that the Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds had land for dozens of plough teams, owned hundreds of pigs in its forests, and collected rents from scores of burgesses in the town that had grown up around its protective walls. It lists mills, fisheries, and salt pans, each one a revenue stream feeding the abbey's treasury. This data allows us to move beyond stories of pious sheep farmers and into the realm of economic analysis. We can calculate the agricultural output, estimate the population under monastic administration, and understand the sheer scale of their integrated economic operations. The Domesday Book provides an external, secular validation of their wealth. A royal audit that confirms their financial dominance was not a later myth or an exaggeration by monastic chroniclers, but a concrete, contemporary reality. Why does this dry, 900-year-old survey matter so much? It freezes a moment in time, proving that the monastic economic machine was already fully operational, powerful, and deeply woven into the fabric of the nation just a generation after the Norman conquest. This was not wealth that accumulated slowly over centuries, it was a pre-existing condition of the realm. The king's officials were not interested in spiritual merits, only in taxable assets and productive capacity. Their cold, bureaucratic assessment reveals the monasteries for what they were, the foundational corporations of the medieval economy. Their roots sunk deep into the soil of England long before their most famous abbeys reached for the sky. This documented evidence of their rooted power makes their eventual fate, centuries later, not just a religious upheaval, but the greatest transfer of real estate and capital in English history. Before the Cistercians reshaped the wilderness, a different kind of monastic economy flourished, one built not on wool and iron but on prayer itself. The Cluniac order, emerging in the 10th century, perfected a system where their primary product was spiritual, a celestial service offered to an anxious nobility. Their workshops were the choir stalls, their output was divine intercession. Wealthy lords and ladies, haunted by fears for their souls and the fate of their lineage, sought a spiritual insurance policy. They donated vast estates, villages, and precious treasures to Cluny and its network of dependent priories. In return, the monks provided an unending cycle of liturgical prayer, a perpetual chant aimed at shortening the donor's time in purgatory and securing their place in heaven. This created a self-reinforcing economic engine. The more land and wealth that was donated, the more monks could be supported, and the more elaborate and continuous the prayer services could become. This magnificence, in turn, attracted even more patronage from those wishing to associate their names with such a powerful spiritual operation. The ultimate expression of this success was Cluny Abbey itself, the largest church in Christendom for centuries. Its soaring arches, its golden altars, and its army of hundreds of monks chanting day and night were not signs of vanity, but the visible proof of a thriving spiritual industry. Yet this model carried inherent vulnerabilities. Unlike the Cistercians who actively worked their own lands, the Cluniacs primarily lived on rents and dues from the donated estates worked by peasant tenants. Their income was passive, dependent on the agricultural success of others and the continued goodwill of the feudal system. When harvests failed or political winds shifted, that river of rent could slow to a trickle. Furthermore, the very splendor that validated their power became a target for critics like Bernard of Clairvaux, who saw not a fortress of prayer but a palace of decadence. The Cluniac model demonstrated that in the medieval economy, the most valuable commodity for some was not wool or wine, but the promise of salvation, a promise that built one of the most breathtaking monuments of the age before the very source of its wealth became its greatest liability. The plague arrived on ships, a silent stowaway that would unravel centuries of economic order. By the 1350s, the Black Death had swept across Europe, leaving fields empty and cities silent. For the monasteries, this was not just a human tragedy but a direct assault on their entire operational model. Their greatest asset, the disciplined workforce of lay brothers, was decimated. The very men who managed the vast granges and tended the legendary flocks were among the first to die, their communal living making them tragically vulnerable. Suddenly, the intricate machine of ora et labora ground to a halt, its gears seized by mortality. With so many workers gone, a fundamental economic shift became unavoidable. The surviving laborers, now a scarce and precious resource, discovered their newfound power. They could demand higher wages for their work, and lords and abbots had no choice but to pay. The manorial system, which had provided a steady, cheap supply of labor for generations, crumbled almost overnight. For a Cistercian abbey that relied on direct exploitation of its lands, this was a catastrophic blow. The cost of running their agricultural and industrial enterprises skyrocketed, devouring the profits that had once built cathedrals. At the same time, the market for their goods collapsed. A population halved by pestilence simply did not need the same mountains of grain or the same endless bolts of woolen cloth. The great international fairs grew quieter, and the price of their premium commodities fell. The river of gold from the wool trade slowed to a meager stream. Monasteries that had operated with the financial precision of modern corporations suddenly found themselves drowning in red ink. Some were forced to take on crippling debts just to feed their remaining monks. Others made a painful, strategic retreat from their founding principles. To keep their lands productive, they began leasing them out to tenant farmers, abandoning the direct management that had been the source of their competitive edge for centuries. The great silence of the plague years was followed by the quiet, reluctant sound of an economic empire contracting, forced to adapt to a world it no longer controlled. A king's personal crisis became the final audit for 1,000 years of monastic wealth. Henry VIII's break with Rome was more than a religious schism. It was a prelude to the greatest property grab in English history. His eyes turned to the monasteries not just as centers of papal loyalty, but as reservoirs of unimaginable riches waiting to be tapped. The first step was a survey, a project of breathtaking scope known as the Valor Ecclesiasticus. Royal commissioners fanned out across the kingdom, entering every abbey and priory. Their task was not spiritual, it was brutally financial. They inventoried everything, from the rental income of vast estates down to the value of the silver candlesticks on the altar. This document was not created to understand the monk's way of life, but to price it for liquidation. It revealed, in cold, hard numbers, the awesome scale of the fortune that the silent orders had built. The annual income of the monastic institutions was staggering, a river of gold that now flowed directly into the royal treasury sites. The legal machinery of dissolution began to turn with ruthless efficiency. A series of Acts of Parliament passed between 1536 and 1540 first targeted the smaller houses, arguing they were dens of vice and idleness, and then moved relentlessly onto the great abbeys themselves. The process was swift and final. Royal officials arrived, ordered the monks to leave, and sealed the gates. The great libraries were scattered, the lead was stripped from the roofs for its value, and the sacred treasures were melted down for coin. The monks themselves were given small pensions or cast adrift, their world erased with the stroke of a pen. But what happened to the physical embodiment of all that accumulated wealth? The lands, the buildings, the very stones themselves, they were sold. The crown, while enriched by the initial seizure, quickly moved to sell off this colossal portfolio of real estate to pay for Henry's wars and to secure the loyalty of his subjects. The buyers were the rising class of the gentry and the established nobility. Vast monastic estates, which had been managed as single corporate units for centuries, were broken up and sold to these new secular landlords. This created a new landed elite, a class whose power and wealth were rooted not in ancient feudal titles, but in a real estate deal orchestrated by the king. The transformation of the English landscape was immediate and profound. The great abbey church, once the heart of a bustling spiritual and economic community, might be left as a romantic ruin. Its stone was often quarried to build a nobleman's new country house. The granges and mills were integrated into new, privately owned agricultural enterprises. The silent, disciplined hum of the monastic machine was replaced by the clamor of a new, capitalist countryside. The dissolution was the ultimate demonstration of the monastery's economic power. The very fact that their dismantling could reshape the entire social and economic structure of a nation proved just how deeply their roots had grown. The silent orders were gone, but the wealth they had created would fuel the ambitions of a New England for centuries to come. A pilgrim in Paris could deposit his coins with stern, white-clad knights and then travel across the known world to Jerusalem, where he would present a coded letter and receive his funds intact. This was the revolutionary financial service of the Knights Templar, a monastic military order whose economic ingenuity created the framework for modern banking. While the Cistercians mastered the land, the Templars mastered the movement of money itself. Their network of preceptories, which were essentially fortified monasteries, stretched from London to the Levant, forming a secure and trusted international system. A traveler no longer had to risk carrying a fortune in gold through bandit-infested lands. He could entrust his wealth to the Templars in his home city and receive a letter of credit, a piece of parchment that was as good as gold anywhere their order had a presence. The Templar brother in Jerusalem would recognize the specific seal and the complex cipher on the document, honoring the withdrawal without question. This system was built on an unshakable reputation for integrity and security, a reputation backed by their vows and their military might. Their preceptories were not just banks but impregnable vaults, often featuring the first round churches in Europe, designed to mimic the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and to be easily defensible. This financial network generated immense profits through fees and exchange rates, but their economic role expanded even further. They began offering loans not just to pilgrims but to the most powerful men in Europe. Kings, including the English crown, routinely borrowed vast sums from the Templars to finance their wars and crusades. The order effectively became the bankers to royalty, managing royal treasuries and even acting as tax collectors. This financial empire was funded by a different kind of donation. While monks received land for prayer, the Templars received estates and treasures from nobles eager to support the crusading effort in a tangible way. These vast landholdings across Europe produced agricultural revenue that, much like the Cistercian model, funded their operations. But for the Templars, the ultimate product was not wool or iron, but military security in the Holy Land. Their financial machine paid for knights, castles, and supplies in a perpetual, expensive war. Their transnational structure was their greatest strength, allowing them to move funds and resources across political borders with an ease no king could match. Yet this very power, this vast and secretive wealth, would ultimately spell their doom. Their abrupt and brutal suppression in the early 14th century, orchestrated by a French king deep in their debt, was a stark reminder that the greatest financial empire could still be shattered by the sword of a single, desperate monarch. The patchwork of English fields tells a quiet story of monastic planning. Those neat, hedged boundaries you see from a train window often follow the precise lines of a long-vanished Cistercian grange, a landscape fossilized by 1,000 years of ownership. Walk through the countryside and you will find their names etched onto maps and village signs, places like Monkton, Abbotsleigh, or Kirkstall, all whispering of an era when these lands were governed by a silent corporate hand. This is the most tangible legacy, the physical earth reshaped by their economic vision. Yet their true inheritance is not just in stone and soil, but in the very architecture of our modern world. The monks did not just farm land, they forged the concept of the corporation itself. A monastery was a legal entity that could own property, make contracts, and exist in perpetuity, separate from the individual monks who lived and died within its walls. This idea that an institution could have a life of its own became the bedrock for the joint stock companies and global enterprises that would follow. Their sophisticated record-keeping, their annual account rolls, and their centralized administration provided a working blueprint for the emerging nation-states of Europe. When kings sought to manage their own realms and revenues, they often looked to the meticulous bureaucracy already perfected within the cloister. The monastic model of direct estate management, with its focus on efficiency, surplus, and reinvestment, offered a powerful precursor to capitalist agriculture. They demonstrated how to organize labor and resources on a massive scale, turning wilderness into a productive asset. Even the romantic ruins that dot the European landscape are a testament to this system. They are not merely beautiful relics, they are the skeletons of a vast economic organism. The crumbling walls of Fountains Abbey or Tintern stand as silent witnesses to a time when prayer and productivity were fused into a single, world-changing force, a system whose echoes still shape our fields, our laws, and our understanding of wealth itself. The quiet hum of monastic industry was not confined to the countryside. Beyond their remote cloisters, these silent orders became the founders of bustling towns and the architects of urban life. A perfect blueprint for this ambition survives in a single, breathtaking document, the Plan of St. Gall. Drawn in the early 9th century, this intricate diagram lays out the ideal layout for a complete monastic city. It was not just a design for a church and dormitories, but a comprehensive vision for a self-sufficient community, with houses for craftsmen, a school, a hospital, a brewery, and even stables, all neatly arranged within a fortified perimeter. This was a master plan for civilization drafted by monks. Across Europe, this vision became a reality. Around great abbeys like Bury St. Edmunds in England or Cluny in France, towns sprang to life under the direct rule of the monastery. The abbey walls offered a powerful magnet, a promise of security and stability in a violent world. The monks, in their role as lords, provided the essential framework for urban growth. They chartered the town, granting it legal status and the right to hold a regular market. They built and maintained the critical infrastructure, constructing sturdy bridges over rivers and engineering reliable water supplies through conduits and pipes. Why would a religious order involve itself in such worldly affairs? The answer, as always, was a blend of spiritual mission and economic pragmatism. A thriving town at your gates was a powerful new revenue stream. The monastery collected rents from the burgage plots where merchants built their homes and shops. They levied tolls on every cart and pack horse that entered their market. They held monopolies on essential services like the grain mill or the baking oven, earning a fee from every loaf of bread baked and every sack of flour ground. This urban development extended the long arm of monastic influence directly into the heart of Europe's commercial revolution. The abbot was not just a spiritual father, he was the mayor, the judge, and the primary landlord of a vibrant economic center. The town itself became a living extension of the monastic corporation, a testament to its ability to shape not only landscapes but also the very patterns of human settlement, proving that their economic vision was as potent in the crowded street as it was in the silent field. Their legacy is written not only in stone and ledger books, but in the very soil beneath our feet. A modern lens reveals these silent orders as pioneers of environmental stewardship, managing their vast domains with a perspective that stretched across centuries. For an institution designed to last until the end of time, the health of the land was not a quarterly concern, but a sacred, multi-generational trust. This long-term outlook fostered practices we would now call profoundly sustainable. Their hallmark innovation, the three-field system of crop rotation, was a perfect example. By letting one field lie fallow each year, they allowed the earth to rest and regenerate, ensuring its fertility for future generations of monks and the countless souls who depended on their surplus. This was the antithesis of exhausting the soil for short-term profit. Their management of forests was equally deliberate. A Cistercian abbey did not simply clear-cut a woodland for timber or charcoal. They practiced a form of forestry that balanced harvest with regrowth, preserving the wood as a perpetual resource for building, for fuel, and for the ecosystem it supported. Even their initial transformations of the landscape, the draining of marshes and clearing of dense forests, were not acts of mere conquest. Once they had tamed these wildernesses, they did not abandon them to depletion. They became careful, conservative managers of the new environments they had created. The fish ponds they engineered are a classic illustration. These were not just decorative features, but highly efficient, renewable protein farms. By controlling the water flow and breeding stocks, they created a closed-loop system that provided a reliable, Friday-friendly food source year after year without depleting natural river stocks. Of course, their impact was not without its ecological cost. The introduction of large-scale sheep farming altered local ecologies, and their forges consumed vast quantities of charcoal. Yet, when measured against the slash-and-burn mentality of the age, their approach was remarkably forward-thinking. The stability of the institution itself was the key. A feudal lord might exploit his land to finance a single war or a daughter's dowry, but an abbey, as an eternal corporation, had a vested interest in the land's perpetual health. Their relationship with the earth was fundamentally one of stewardship, not mere exploitation. They saw themselves as caretakers of a creation that was on loan from God, a philosophy that echoes powerfully in our modern conversations about sustainability, corporate responsibility, and the urgent need to think beyond the next financial quarter. This deep, generational connection to place raises a final, compelling question about the nature of their influence. How did this intricate system of land, labor, and faith ultimately shape the political landscape of the medieval world itself? The Scriptorium was a factory of light in a world of shadows. Here, the scratch of a quill was the sound of knowledge being rescued from oblivion. For a monastery, this quiet room was far more than a place of pious work. It was a high-value production line for one of the medieval world's most precious commodities, the written word. Every stage of this production was expensive. The raw material was parchment, made from the carefully treated skins of countless calves, sheep, or goats. A single large Bible might require the skins of over 200 animals, a massive investment before a single word was even written. Then came the inks, painstakingly mixed from soot, gallnuts, and rare pigments, and for the most luxurious volumes, the shimmering gold leaf that made the pages seem to capture divine light itself. The finished product was not merely a book, it was a treasure chest of spiritual and intellectual wealth. A lavishly illuminated gospel could be worth as much as a small estate, a tangible asset of staggering value. These volumes were not kept solely on library shelves. They were strategic tools. A wealthy abbot might present a magnificent Bible to a king, a gift that was also a powerful statement of influence and a bid for royal favor. In an era of uncertain finances, such a book could even be offered as collateral for a substantial loan, its value as secure as any plot of land. But the true economic power of the Scriptorium went beyond the books themselves. In an almost entirely illiterate society, the monastery's control over the written word gave it a near-total monopoly on literacy and administrative skill. A king needing clerks to manage his treasury, diplomats to draft treaties, or scribes to record his laws had to look to the monasteries. The monks and the students they trained were the only ones who could navigate the complexities of written law and accountancy. This made the monastery the indispensable training ground for the civil servants who ran kingdoms, weaving its influence directly into the fabric of secular power. The Scriptorium, therefore, was not just preserving culture, it was manufacturing a unique form of capital that blended spiritual authority, political clout, and pure, undeniable financial worth. A monastery's gates were never truly closed to the world outside. While the monks sought silence within, their rule demanded they open their doors wide to those in need. This was the sacred duty of hospitality and almsgiving, a practice that transformed these wealthy institutions into the primary social safety net of the medieval world. The Benedictine rule was explicit. All guests who arrived were to be received as Christ himself. This was not a vague ideal, but a daily, operational reality. Monasteries maintained dedicated guest houses, essentially the inns of their era, offering free shelter, food, and even fresh horses to any traveler, from wandering pilgrims to merchants and nobles. More profoundly, they operated infirmaries that cared for the sick and the dying, regardless of their station, providing a level of medical charity that simply did not exist elsewhere. And each day, at a set hour, the monastery's almoner would appear at the gate to distribute bread, ale, and sometimes even coins to a line of local poor. This was a systematic, organized redistribution of wealth on a massive scale. Why would an institution so focused on its own spiritual perfection dedicate such vast resources to the outside world? The answer is a blend of profound faith and deep pragmatism. Charity was a non-negotiable spiritual obligation, a direct command to love one's neighbor. But it also functioned as a brilliant strategic investment. This constant flow of charity legitimized the monastery's immense wealth in the eyes of the surrounding community. How could anyone resent the abbey's full granaries when those same granaries fed you during a famine? How could a local lord challenge an institution that cared for his sick peasants and sheltered his traveling retainers? The monastery made itself indispensable. It cultivated a vast reservoir of goodwill and, crucially, a dependent population. The hundreds of people who relied on the abbey for their daily bread or their only chance at medical care would naturally defend their benefactor. In a dispute with a secular lord or even the crown, the monastery could count on the support of the entire community it sustained. This charitable work did more than just protect the abbey, it actively stabilized the entire feudal region. In a society built on stark inequality, where a poor harvest could mean starvation, the monastery's resources acted as a critical buffer. They softened the hardest edges of medieval life, preventing total destitution and the social unrest that followed. By recycling their economic surplus into the community, the monks cemented their role not just as spiritual guides, but as the foundational pillar of secular society, a pillar built as much on bread and medicine as on prayer and stone. The silent army of lay brothers began to fade away. This was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, inevitable erosion of the very workforce that had powered the Cistercian miracle. After the cataclysm of the Black Death, the social landscape of Europe was remade. A world of scarcity had been turned upside down, becoming a world of startling opportunity for the laborer. The bustling towns and cities, hungry for hands to rebuild and to craft, now offered wages and freedoms that the monastic Grange could not match. Why would a man choose a life of backbreaking labor under a vow of silence and obedience when he could earn good coin as a carpenter in a growing city, marry, and own a small home? The spiritual security of the monastery was losing its appeal against the tangible promise of social and economic mobility. This new reality struck at the financial heart of the system. The cost of hiring free laborers to do the work once performed by devout conversi began to soar, eating directly into the profits that had once seemed limitless. The economic logic that had made the lay brother system so brilliantly efficient was crumbling. Internally, a quieter fracture was also widening. A growing emphasis on clerical education and status among the choir monks created a deeper social chasm between them and their lay brethren. The lay brothers, once seen as spiritual partners in a shared enterprise, were increasingly viewed as mere laborers, a lower class within the holy walls. Resentment simmered. There are records of lay brothers protesting their treatment, demanding better food and more respect, a clear sign that the old discipline was breaking down. This internal tension made the system harder to manage and far less attractive to new recruits. The response from the abbeys was a strategic retreat. They began to lease out their vast, consolidated granges to tenant farmers. This shift from direct exploitation to rental income was a fundamental transformation of their economic model. It was safer and easier, but it came at a great cost. The monastery surrendered control. It no longer managed the land for maximum yield, no longer captured 100% of the surplus, and no longer guaranteed the quality of its own wool or grain. The profits became a fixed rent, vulnerable to inflation and poor harvests, rather than a share of a booming enterprise. The slow disappearance of the lay brother was the quiet end of an era, the moment the most powerful economic engine in Christendom began to power down, forced to adapt to a world it could no longer command. The silent orders of the Middle Ages built an economic legacy that is both profound and paradoxical. They demonstrated with stunning clarity how deep spiritual devotion could fuel monumental material achievement, creating a world where prayer and profit were not opposing forces, but two sides of the same sacred coin. We have walked through the Cistercian granges, those corporate farms that industrialized agriculture. We have seen the Carthusians turn their solitude into a brand of priceless craftsmanship, and watched the Templars invent international finance from their fortified chapels. We have witnessed the Cluniac order build an empire on the spiritual currency of prayer and the patronage it attracted. This was not a single story, but a vast tapestry woven from threads of innovation, disciplined management, and unshakable faith. Their collective story offers urgent lessons for our own time. It teaches us that true sustainability is not a quarterly report, but a generational vision, a commitment to stewarding resources for a future you will never see. It reminds us that institutional strength can be built on principles that transcend mere profit, on a sense of purpose that motivates deeper than personal gain. And it forces us to acknowledge that even the most spiritual of pursuits have tangible, world-altering consequences. The haunting ruins of their great abbeys are not just relics of a lost faith. They are the skeletal monuments of a lost economic system, a way of organizing land, labor, and capital that once structured the very fabric of Europe. As you look at our own landscape of corporations and institutions, consider what they might learn from these ancient corporations of prayer. How might a long-term vision reshape our relationship with the planet? Could a purpose beyond profit create more resilient organizations? The echoes of their silent labor are still with us if we know how to listen. Share your reflections in the comments below and subscribe for more journeys into the hidden economies that have shaped our world.